right, so what we're going to do now is look at our two Depression-era presidents. So these two men, Herbert Hoover on the left and Franklin Roosevelt on the right, are going to be president during this particular amount of time. One is really famous in American history, and one is not. And for a lot of that, you can blame the Great Depression. The interesting thing about presidents, right, is they don't get to pick the circumstances under which their presidency will unfold. Right? If you go back to a guy like George W. Bush, he had no idea when he was elected president of the United States that the attacks on 9/11 would happen just a few months later and would come to define his presidency. Same thing with a guy like President Obama. When he's elected in 2008, it looks like the economy is doing fairly well. And then during that election campaign, right before the election's even held, the economy collapses and the country goes into recession. So the plans that he had, he has to switch because he's got a different set of circumstances. You look here at the end of President Trump's term as President of the United States. If you go back a year, and I'm doing this in December of 2020, if you go back a year at this time, he probably pretty easily wins another term as President of the United States. The economy is doing well, which is usually a pretty good sign that people will keep the president. How could he have known that the pandemic was going to happen, the social unrest and things like that, that you could probably blame for losing him a second term as President of the United States? So we just really don't have an idea, and these guys don't have an idea, right? Abraham Lincoln didn't know when he showed up that his entire presidency is going to be taken up in a horrible civil war. But what these guys do is they have an opportunity to respond. And so for a lot of them, it is the response that they're going to put in, right? You look at a guy like George W. Bush, and it was a contested election in the year 2000, right? We didn't know who was going to be president for a long time after that election. And what happens after 9/11 is people kind of looked, at least for a while, and said, we have the right man for the job. Just the confidence that he was able to project through that crisis had a lot of people convinced that that was the guy that we needed. So the first guy we see here is Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover is a Republican, and he was a very, very good administrator. This becomes very clear during World War I when he is the head of the Food Administration. So he's in charge of the federal response to try and save food to send to our troops and to send to other countries overseas that don't have food because their soldiers are fighting in World War I. And so he's the man that's going to be in charge of that response. This is the guy that is going to ask Americans to observe meatless Mondays or wheatless Wednesdays in order to send people over. It goes very, very well and makes him kind of a rising star around the world. And in 1928, it's the Roaring Twenties. We needed somebody just to kind of keep the party going. And so they thought, this is a very steady man. He's a good administrator. This is going to be somebody who is able to do that. Well, he gets elected in 1928, but little did he know that in 1929, the stock market was going to collapse about 10 months after he's taken the oath of office. Now, what that tells us, and if you look, the president doesn't have a ton to do with the economy as a whole. He gets blamed for it a lot or gets credit for it when it's not necessarily something that the executive branch has a lot of power over. So when the stock market collapses in 1929, it's not something Herbert Hoover did, but he is sure going to get blamed for it. One of my favorite pictures of the Great Depression, you look at it, it says $100 will buy this car, must have cash, lost all on the stock market. And that I just think is one cool car But you think, man, for $100 you're able to buy that, and it shows just the desperate situation that people are in. So even though he doesn't cause the problem, how's Hoover going to respond to this? Well, not very well. He had what he called a laissez-faire approach to this, a hands-off. He said, hey, the economy's gone up and down before, it will fix itself. What he didn't realize is, like we talked about the stock market collapse, that the financial system was broken in places it wasn't going to be able to come back from without help. The banking collapse meant that the engine that kind of keeps our economy going was fundamentally broken. He asked for people to join him in what he called volunteerism. He asked corporation owners not to cut workforce and not to cut wages. Well, the problem is, if I'm a factory owner and nobody's buying my product, I can't afford to keep the number of people working for me that are working for me, and I can't afford to keep them at the same price. And so even though that's a nice idea, just economically it wasn't feasible. He is going to make loans to farmers. Farmers, if you remember way back in the 20s visuals, had a rough time in the 20s anyway. And so he's trying to make incentives for farmers, because pretty quickly people are going to be running out of food. He's trying to make incentives for farmers to grow certain crops. Very famously, the government will collect and buy crops from people and then burn them. Never a good idea when people are hungry for your government to buy crops and then burn them. It doesn't really go over very well with the people. There's also going to be a debacle with a group called the Bonus Army, a group of World War I veterans who come to Washington, D.C. Looking for some relief. I'll post a video on the YouTube playlist of that little snafu for you to take a look at. Doesn't take very long for Hoover to become the villain of the Great Depression. This was called a Hooverville. And so they named it after him. Basically, when people lost their homes, they would go to public land and just nail together any wood or metal they could find to find shelter. There was a famous Hooverville in Central Park at this time. People would also walk around with their pockets turned inside out. They called it flying the Hoover flag. Basically, it was a sign that you had no money in your pockets. This fellow needed what was referred to as a Hoover blanket. Those were old newspapers, is what they called Hoover blankets, because people couldn't afford blankets. They were curling up under newspapers. So it's easy to see that when the next election rolls around, this guy's not going to win it, right? He is being blamed for the Great Depression, fairly or unfairly. Probably the biggest thing he needs blamed for is his response just wasn't very good. But in the election of 1932, the Democrats are going to run a man named Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt had been a Secretary of the Navy. He's a distant cousin to Teddy Roosevelt, and he had been the governor of New York. FDR was also our first disabled or handicapped president. He was stricken with polio, or a disease that mimicked polio, as an older man. That's one of the reasons they don't think maybe it was polio, is he was older when he got it. But it eventually will rob him of the use of his legs. He'll be in a wheelchair of his own design for most of the time he's president of the United States. The interesting thing is the press agrees to not take pictures of him in that manner. He had some leg braces that allowed him to look like he was walking. Had a car specially designed so that the gas and brake were with handles instead of pedals. And so newsreels and things like that, people didn't really have an idea of what was going on. Now, obviously, that's something that we look at in 2020. That's never going to happen. But back in the 1930s, that was something the press was really willing to do for the president. So FDR is going to give a famous inaugural address, and I'll link that for you on the playlist, in which he tells people they have nothing to fear but fear itself. This is an electoral map of the election of 1932. Franklin Roosevelt won 472 electoral votes. Herbert Hoover, 59. Herbert Hoover apparently put up a gallant effort, but kind of knew that he wasn't going to win. Anyway, And for most of the country, they said, let's let this Roosevelt guy try. Roosevelt offers the American people what he calls a New Deal. Basically says, look, this last guy wasn't doing anything. I'm going to try everything. He closes every bank in the country for a number of days, sends out federal people, and says, okay, if this bank reopens, it is going to reopen because the government has certified it and said it's safe to put your money in here. He also will have Congress pass the FDIC, which is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Basically, it is a government guarantee that if you put your money in a bank and that bank collapses, the government will return your money up to, I think the limit today is like $250,000. It's never been a big problem for me. I've never had quite that much in the bank. But you'll see that if you go to an ATM or you walk into a bank and you see the sticker on the window, it'll say insured by the FDIC. Roosevelt also starts to pass what are called the alphabet soup programs. And the alphabet soup programs are called that because they all have three-letter acronyms, things like the WPA or the TVA, that will be these programs to get people back to work. He had another interesting idea. He wanted to get some people out of work. He has Congress pass the Social Security Act, which basically gives older people money not to go to work. You could retire. Now, his logic behind that was, all right, if we have older people and we're taking care of them, we can get younger men with families jobs. And so by paying for one older person to stay home, you might be feeding 8, 9, 10 people. The interesting thing is Social Security, of course, is still around today. Those of you that work will know that some of your paycheck goes into Social Security. It was never meant to last this long. I think if we could ask FDR today what he thought, it just wasn't designed that way. You keep hearing about people trying to fix it, and it's something that politicians will be doing. But FDR was definitely trying some things. He was going to do his best to make sure that the country at least had a fighting chance. So how do we put people back to work? How do we repair this financial system? And we're going to explore in a little bit more detail some of these alphabet soup programs to see what it is that was going on there. So that is a little bit of Hoover and FDR. FDR is going to be the only president elected more than twice to the office. And so really for the next 6-7 weeks, when I ask a question about who the president of the United States is, you're probably not going to be wrong if you guess Franklin Roosevelt, because he's going to be our president of the Great Depression. And this Great Depression winds to a close. World War II is on the horizon.